All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for having me here at the Mid-South Stalker Conference. So this is one that I've wanted to come to for a while now, and a lot of times it ends up kind of being on top of our state cattlemen's convention. So I haven't had the opportunity to get up here yet, but I did this year, so I appreciate the invitation to be here and visit with you all. So the topic today is one that I think is really timely and important, particularly as we think about just the weather that we're experiencing today, right? So when I packed my bag to come up here, in my mind, the Alabama girl thought, well, hey, I'm going to need to pack my sweater and my vest because it's going to be cold in Kentucky. Well, I think it's supposed to be like 80 degrees here today, right? And same when I get back home to Alabama later this evening. So we deal with these challenges of changing weather conditions all the time, but how can we practically have management tools within our forage system to kind of help buffer us from some of these changes we see with our weather conditions? So that kind of leads us into our first part of the presentation where, in general, weather is always part of our conversation. If you're like me, first thing I do when I get up in the morning is I look at the weather for the day. I look at it for what it's going to be for the next week. And so for those of you guys with stalker cattle and farming, you know, the weather is part of our everyday life. And we have seen that over time, we have kind of these changing weather conditions that we're dealing with and how those impact our forage systems. So in particular, we see patterns where maybe we have increased periods of warming. That changes the way that our forages grow. It changes the way that those react to having a certain stocking rate in our pasture system. We also see, though, that there's changing climate in other terms, right? So changing climate from the standpoint of our input costs. Those are always changing, with especially this past year increasing input costs. So what can we control then within our forage management system to help buffer us from these ever-changing conditions with the actual weather and then these changing conditions with our input costs as well? So these are some strategies that I put together to improve our management specifically within our tall fescue systems. What are some things that we can do on our farm to better enhance that forage productivity or help those pastures be persistent under these changing conditions, whether it's the actual weather or the input cost? So this requires what I call a systems approach, where we're looking at the effects of the animals on the pasture system and what's happening both above ground and below ground in that pasture system. What are the things I can do management-wise to enhance that root system, to be productive, to help me grow that forage above ground, and help that forage be persistent and productive over time? Okay, so we're going to break this down a few different ways. We have our effects of weather and these kind of changing input conditions on below ground in the tall fescue system, above ground, and then thinking about how these weather conditions impact other grasses and weeds that we see coming into our pasture systems. So first of all, what are some management tools we can think about from the below ground perspective? What can I do to manage to make sure that my fescue is going to be persistent in these conditions where I have these periods of warming? And fescue is a cool season forage, right? So it's going to start to go to sleep during those time periods where we have those higher temperatures, particularly when we think about those early months of summer as that fescue is starting to go dormant. We're on that pasture system. What is happening? What can I do to make sure that my stand is in good health as I get ready for the next production season, right? So the first thing that we can practically do in our systems is to look at our soil conditions. So doing a soil condition assessment, one, having that soil test information tells us about the production potential that we can have out of the soil on our farm. And soil pH is one that I think that we have a good potential to go back, and it's an easy thing that we can look at to just see, are we within the right soil pH range for our pasture systems on our farm? So what's the implication of that, right? We know that soil pH is important, but I think if we look at this figure up here, we can see that, first of all, we have kind of this optimum soil pH range, 6.2 to 7.3. What do we notice about those major nutrients that we're putting on our pasture in that range? They're in the green box. They're in the green box when we're within that soil pH range. But if we're lower than that, those nutrients are not available to our plants in our pasture. Okay, so having that soil pH range be in the right range is the first step to give that forage the chance to be able to take up the nutrients that are in the soil or that we're then applying to be able to enhance pasture production. Okay, so that's an easy something that we can go back and look at to see just, am I within the right range for my farm right now? If I'm not, then the first decision that we make is typically to go in and apply lime in that situation. So the lime is going to be what helps us get into that optimum range. Then we can go back and make those additional fertility inputs. Okay, so it's optimizing the choice on our fertility management during that time period. What are some other things we can do related to fertilization in our pasture systems for production? Another thing we can think about is targeted fertilization. Okay, so this is going to help us, particularly when we're in this time with fluctuating input costs related to fertilizer. So a tool that is coming on board more and more, we see this in particular, if any of you row crop, you may already be doing this. You may already be grid sampling across your pastures. But what that's doing is it's basically breaking that pasture up into zones or little grids, squares, that tell us the specific nutrient needs for that part of the pasture. So in the photo here, you can see the areas that are in green. If we're looking at soil pH, those had good soil pH for the forage crop that person was trying to grow. And then the zones that have the red, orange, or yellow are the ones where maybe there needed to be lime applied to amend that and improve that soil pH. Okay, so overall what this is doing is it's providing a more precise approach to that fertilizer management, and it's altering the amount of that fertilizer that I'm having to purchase and put out there. Okay, so it's not always a savings in fertilizer, but it's optimizing what I put out to have more long-term benefit of that fertilizer. So the resolution of those grids or the zones that we have in the pasture is important. And the smaller resolution that we have, the more accurate we can be. But a lot of our producers that are doing this, particularly like in hay fields, are using a 5 or a 10 acre grid as a starting point, and then maybe breaking that down further as they feel more comfortable with that technology. So a lot of times this is a service that's offered through whoever you buy your fertilizer through. It may be something to talk to them about. How do I learn more about this? Is this something that would be applicable on my farm to, again, kind of help me buffer against these changes in weather and changes in input costs that I'm seeing? Next we have, how do we manage those pastures to be persistent over time? And so this is kind of where the issue of the warmer weather coming in, and maybe we're seeing some of those warm season forages from where I'm from. They're moving north, right? They're getting into our tall fescue pastures. They're taking out the space where maybe the fescue used to be, and the fescue is kind of backing off or declining some. So this is why management for the root system of that perennial grass is important. When we think about our forages, most of the time, like that first picture I showed with the cattle that are out grazing on the pasture, what do we see? We see the above ground growth, we see the animals out there grazing, and that's what we're seeing being translated into pounds of gain on those cattle, right? We're not seeing what's happening below ground. But that's a big driver of the persistence of that forage in your pasture. And so making sure that as we get towards the end of the growing season, in particular for that fescue, that we don't continue to overgraze that fescue into the summer months. That's helping build a stronger root system, stronger root reserve as we move into the time when that fescue is going to jump back up and start growing again as we get into the cool season months. So it's called banking. That's what I like to refer to it as, is that I'm banking the nutrients into those roots to help them have what they need to be able to make my pasture regrow and be productive later in the growing season. So overgrazing and the root system are linked together. What about above ground? What are our tools that we can do above ground to help buffer against some of these weather conditions? So one strategy for that is if we're thinking about maybe trying to extend our pasture use throughout the year, we can provide supplementation on pasture. Okay, so that can do one of two things. By providing supplementation on pasture, we can potentially be able to increase our stocking rate on those pastures, or by supplementing on pasture, maybe we're able to extend the length of that growing season some, right? Because those animals are eating supplement. Maybe they're substituting some of the forage they would normally eat for that supplement. Okay, so maybe it helps me get a few more extra grazing days by doing that strategy. So this is kind of our thought process along the lines of why we would want to supplement on pasture. What are some practical ways we can do that? Particularly if, not all of your land is right there together, right? Somebody I know on the row crop side used to talk about that they were like patch farming. So they would go to this field and then they got to take the tractor down here to this one to do something else. And so a lot of us are like that when it comes to cattle as well, right? We're not all in this nice contiguous land area where we can do some of these things. So supplementation on pasture is a good strategy maybe to help think about ways to extend that forage availability. This is a study that we conducted at one of our research centers in central Alabama a few years ago. It was a stocker cattle study where we received those cattle in the fall of the year and then put them on annual ryegrass pasture. So for our stocker producers, that tends to be one of our key systems, is using those cool season annuals during the winter and spring months for gain. And we looked at, in the annual ryegrass system, different supplementation strategies. Okay, so all of the supplements that you see up here are high energy feedstuffs, and that high energy is important to be able to support those gain and gain per acre goals that we have in this grazing system. In particular, we wanted to look at what we would consider lower rates of supplementation of these high energy feeds. Okay, so on the bottom, you can see that this is the percent of animal body weight per day that we were feeding of those cattle. We have 0.25% of animal body weight up to 0.75% of animal body weight per day of supplement that they are receiving of either cracked corn, citrus pulp, or soybean hulls. Okay, so I want you to note over here that the control is shown here with the gray bar. And what did we see as part of this study? So I drew a line across the control to show what was the addition of supplement providing us. Okay, so we saw that by supplementing at really any of these levels, we were getting about a 0.5 pound per day average daily gain response with that supplementation on those cool season pastures. And this just provides us the recommendations for what would be kind of the most efficient supplementation levels that we saw then of the three supplements we were using. So that was 0.25% body weight per day of the cracked corn, or 0.5% body weight per day of our citrus pulp and soybean hulls. Okay, so again, the purpose of this was to provide supplement on pasture to be able to stretch some of those pasture resources, but also try to achieve some additional gain and production out of those animals. Another thought in terms of above ground management in our pasture systems related to supplementation on pasture is thinking about supplements on pasture as a way to fertilize those pastures. Okay, so again, with increased input costs related to fertilizer, this is something that has come back up from that perspective. So a lot of us are doing that, or we're supplementing on pasture, but we may not always think about the nutrient return that's coming from those animals and the value that that's providing back to our pasture system. So this is a study that Dr. Gunner did. Actually, Dr. Gunner's here with us. He's a professor at Western Kentucky. This was part of his dissertation work, where he looked at being able to supplement on pasture or add clovers to the pasture system to be able to reduce the nitrogen fertilization rate in a cool season pasture system. So we can see here that these are treatments where our control was just our regular nitrogen fertilization rate on that annual ryegrass pasture for the growing season, and we didn't have any clover or any supplement that we were providing those stocker cattle in that treatment. The other treatments we're looking at replacing some of that nitrogen fertilizer with either clovers or by feeding supplements on pasture. Okay, so 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre was then applied as fertilizer, and then we estimated that the other 50 would either come from the clovers or the supplements that we were feeding on pasture. The supplements, again, these were at 0.65% of animal body weight per day. Okay, so less than 1% body weight per day of a high energy and a high protein feed, so dry distillers grains or whole cotton seed. which are both byproducts that a lot of our producers tend to use as supplements in Alabama. So we can see, if we look at how did this impact our stocking rate for the pasture system. And I think that this is a neat figure because it shows us the steers per acre that we were able to carry in that system. We can see for our control with our nitrogen fertilization, it was 1.6 head per acre, and we were at 1.4 or 1.3 on the other treatments. Okay, so we were just a little bit under the stocking rate capacity of that nitrogen fertilizer. But again, going in year by year, assessing what the cost of the legumes or the cost of the supplementation might be for you, this might be an option to reduce some of the fertility that we have in those pastures coming from nitrogen, but still providing that source from an alternative method. Okay? So it's kind of a different way to think about supplementation on pasture, but it's a tool to help us buffer against those changing conditions that we see. Another tool we have in our toolbox is to add plant diversity. Okay, and again, the example I have shown here is a cool season annual mixture. This is actually Gray's cover crop system from one of our research farms. But what I wanted to show you about this is that when we add diversity to our pasture systems, it again helps us buffer against those changes in weather, because we see here in this system the grass component is shown by the blue line, the clover is the orange line, and our brassicas, or like forage turnips, kale, etc., for example, that's our black line. What we notice is that early in the growing season we have a lot of grasses out there. As we get later into the production season, that clover component starts to pick up and make up some of that difference, right? Okay, so this example is with cool season annuals, but if we think about that application, particularly in our fescue systems, adding in clovers, we're going to see that response as well, right? Where the seasonality of those clovers is going to help pick us up and carry us at a certain break point in the growing season. So it diversifies our pasture. It gives us something else to put in the system to not kind of have all of our eggs in one basket when we do have the crazy weather conditions that come through and negatively impact that forage growth for a certain period of time. Some final things to think about in terms of above ground management is going into our pasture systems and assessing pasture condition. So again, this is something that I think is practical for most people, is just to go through, do a walkthrough on those pastures. And I say walkthrough because I have this acronym here, GOAL, get out and look. So if we get out and look in the pasture system, we're walking, we're more likely to see maybe where some of those problem weeds or problem areas are occurring. That allows us to develop that targeted strategy for coming in and controlling those weeds. So this is a good time of year to be thinking about doing that. And making sure that we're planning to get those weeds under control, so again, our forages can be more productive as part of that system. Final tools that we have in the toolbox to buffer against weather. I think this is one that is important, and it's one that is changing the further north that we move, where we see that as we stay on those fescue pastures, particularly into the summer months, what that's doing is that it opens up space in that fescue canopy for other things to come in. And in particular, especially in the northern part of our state, we have seen this where we have warm season grass encroachment that's coming into those fescue pastures. And that's because we have these years of mild enough conditions where that fescue is slow growing, and then those warm season grasses get in there and they pick up and grow quickly because they like that warm weather condition. Okay, so what are these warm season grasses? What are their potential for us here in Kentucky? This is a list of kind of the primary warm season grasses that are options in the southeastern U.S. Some of them are not going to be adapted to here, but we are seeing that these warm season forages are tending to move farther north. I think that in particular there are some applications for us here when we think about warm season forages from that standpoint of diversifying our forage stands. Okay, so maybe we do have a small area on our farm where we're in particular looking at some of these warm season annuals. Hey, I was at a meeting yesterday where a lot of folks were talking about crabgrass. I have the crabgrass anyway, so I would say use it. I mean, graze it if you can. If it's in an area where you can use it, it's a good quality forage that has good potential application for these stalker systems. But thinking about that, diversifying our pasture systems, I know Gary Bates, longtime forage extension specialist at Tennessee, used to talk about his kind of 2/3, 1/3 rule, where 2/3 was fescue, 1/3 was maybe something else, right? Whether that be I'm trying to grow some cool season annuals, or maybe I'm trying to look at an area where I can grow some of these warm season annuals. It's a way to diversify what we have. Again, not put all the eggs in one basket, so to speak. So as we think about these warm season grasses, maybe we're not as familiar with those. What do they actually do for us? What do they bring to the table? They provide a short, targeted window of production during the summer months, particularly if we're talking about those summer annuals. Okay, and so some aspects that I think have application to stalker producers is that it's something different, right? So if we're used to these cool season dominant systems, now we have a warm season, it's something different. Moderate quality and generally pretty palatable for those animals as well. Okay, so it adds something different to our production system. It also meets a gap that we have in our growing season. Okay, so maybe it gives us an opportunity to get some mid to late summer grazing, or maybe I can bump that into the fall some, stay off of my fescue for a little bit longer, and then allow that fescue to grow and be more productive and ready for those cattle to be turned out during that transition time period. So one important thing I think about warm season grasses, and I alluded to it on the previous slide as we were talking about crabgrass, is that we have the tendency to think about warm season grasses as a weed, but I don't think of them that way. So if I can use it and if I can graze it, then maybe it's something to consider. So we're not going to go out and make drastic changes, right? But it's something we can look into as a tool in the toolbox. Okay, so in summary, getting back to this concept of the weather and today's talk, we can't control the weather, but we can control what we manage. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at today was, despite these changes that I have no control over, what are the things I can do in my system to make a change and help kind of insulate me from some of this that's going on in the outside world, right? Okay, so that's a combination of a few things. It's going back looking at targeted soil management, forage management, and then applications for supplementation within our system. And precision and accuracy are important. Okay, so a lot of what I talked about, these are not new or novel concepts. It's just going back and trying to do the things that we know how to do them better, or maybe tweak it and apply it in a different way to help insulate us, as I said before. Okay, so with that, I'd be glad to take any questions. If you have questions about some of the concepts in today's talk, I'd encourage you to visit our website, which is shown here, alabamabeefsystems.com. It's where we have all of our extension resources related to these topics. So thank you, Katie, for the invite. Chris.
I was wondering about you didn't mention Johnson grass.
Yes. So that's a good point. So Chris asked about Johnson grass and potential applications. So Johnson grass is a good warm season forage. It's just not very persistent under grazing. So what we typically see is that you may see it in a hayfield setting, but when we go out and actually look for it in pastures, it may not be there for very long because the cattle tend to go and select it, and they like it. So it kind of fits with what I was saying about that palatability. It's something different.